Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chen Hong Chen Shuo from the Department of Sociology. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Anthony Paik. Professor Paik is from the Department of Sociology and currently serves as Secretary of Faculty Senate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also a core faculty member in the Data Analytics and Computational Social Science program. He previously served as the director of the bachelor's degree with individual concentrations and as chair of the sociology department. Before joining UMass Amherst, Professor Paik was a faculty member at the University of Iowa for over a decade. He received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Chicago. Professor Paik's research focused on several areas, including social networks, social demography, and the legal profession. He has many journal articles in prestigious outlets such as the American Sociological Review, Social Networks, and Social Science Research. One of his outstanding social network research is that he analyzed American discussion networks using general social survey and found that the increase of social isolation is largely biased by the interviewer's effect. Professor Paik has many research grants. Most recent one include diversity and networking in law school. Are those students from diverse background disadvantaged, funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, and political misinformation and disinformation through social media biases. The interdisciplinary research grants at UMass Amherst. Professor Paik is active in research collaboration, and I'm so lucky to be part of his law school research team, which is also related to today's talk. The team is productive. The finding has been published in journals such as Social Networks and Law and Social Inquiry, and there are many others in progress. We are truly fortunate to have Professor Paik with us today. He will be sharing his most recent research on the friendship and learning networks of international law students attending United States law schools. His presentation will last about 1 hour, followed by an open discussion. So please welcome Professor Paik.
Thank you, Professor Hong, and thank you to the Department of Sociology here at National Taiwan University for hosting me. I really appreciate having the chance to speak to you all. This is my first time in Taiwan. I haven't been to Asia for a long time, for several decades, and I'm on a trip through Korea, now here to Taiwan, which is where my wife was born, and then we're heading back to Korea before we head back to the States. So I really appreciate the chance to speak to you, particularly given that your semester has already ended, and I'm really pleased that you're coming even after classes ended, so I appreciate it. Thank you. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about some current research, and it's also some of the work that Professor Hong and I have been working on together. And so some of it's in development still, some of it has been applied in different areas based on a paper that we published just recently. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop me, and I can take questions as they come up as I'm speaking. So please feel free to chime in if you have questions or you want to raise a point or something like that. So today I'm going to talk about social networks of international students attending law schools in the United States. And just quickly, here are some of our senior researchers. I have 3 other principal investigators, Carol Silver over there with the glasses, Steve Boucher, and Sweta Balakrishnan are the PIs, and then obviously Chen Shuo Hong and Tanya Rulo Whitworth are our recent PhDs that we're really pleased are continue with our project. So the data set that I'll be talking about today we call it the CELS data, Student Experiences in Law School Survey. There are 4 waves of data, and in each wave we've gathered social network data from the law school students. And we started tracking these students in their first year of law school, which is what we call the 1L year. Law school in the United States goes for 3 years. So we did a survey in the fall semester of the 1L year, and then also in the spring semester of the 1L year, and that was in 2019 fall and 2020 spring. So the spring semester, which was our wave 2, was interrupted by the COVID pandemic. So half of our survey occurred before the pandemic, and then half the survey of wave 2 occurred after the pandemic or during the pandemic. During that period, the students were sent home, actually. So they went to remote schooling during our second wave. Since then, we've collected a third wave, and then we're currently in the process of collecting our fourth wave. We've got the survey done, but we're still trying to get additional responses from the students. They're now all lawyers, or most of them are lawyers now. Initially, we offered the students like $15 per survey. Now that they're lawyers, their rate has gone up. We've had to increase our incentives to $50 per survey. But the lawyers now, they make, it's $225,000 a year. It's hard to get their attention. Funding comes from the Access Lex Institute and the National Science Foundation, but any errors or any attributions should be attributed to us and not to them. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about just generally is what sort of something that Professor Hong and I are interested in, which is network segregation and socio-demographic clustering. So it's this idea that in social networks, particularly amongst, say, students, oftentimes there are clusters of students who are based on shared identities, so those clusters, when they're present in a social network and they spread throughout that network, you can measure it in terms of how segregated a network might be. So that's the general phenomena that kind of motivates our research. And there's different kinds of explanations for where network segregation comes from. One explanation is essentially from lower order processes. It's what we call lower order processes. The tendency for people, some people might be apt to send lots of ties, as well as receive lots of ties. Not particularly complicated explanation. The more traditional and dominant explanation in the literature is what we call a combination of homophily and transitivity. Homophily refers to a phrase the phrase that comes from a long time ago called "birds of a feather flock together." I don't know if there was a similar concept in Chinese history. Yeah. I was trying to figure out where this phrase came from. So there are some attributions of this phrase coming from Britain, but it looks like as far as I could tell, it was mentioned by Plato. Socrates was quoted as saying something essentially that birds of a feather flock together in Plato's Republic. So it's a pretty old phrase. It's what we call homophily today. So one of the explanations for network segregation is that there's lots of homophily going on. But usually researchers combine that with transitivity, which is the idea that a friend of a friend is a friend, right? So that's what we call how there's closed groups. Right? So a friend is more likely to become a friend. So the two mechanisms of homophily and transitivity are often used to argue for why we have network segregation. So today I'm going to talk about something that Professor Hong and I developed as a third explanation beyond the traditional lower order processes and homophily and transitivity, and then apply it to the case of US-based law students, specifically in this case focusing on international students first, and then time permitting, I think I'll probably have enough time talk about some of the JD students, and then also some of the research that Professor Hong and I are currently working on other aspects. So I hadn't discussed that I was going to present it, but I hope you don't mind. We're going to talk about some other stuff in development. Okay, so today I'm going to focus specifically on the friendship and learning networks of international law students. And just to give you some context of what it looks like in the United States, I grabbed this off a website, admittedly. The data come from the ABA, which is the American Bar Association. And it shows the red line is the number of JD students in the United States over time. You might notice there was a dramatic fall in the number of JD students after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And so there was a pretty big drop-off at that time. At the same time, over many years, there was a pretty small number of students in what are known as Master of Law programs, and those started picking up in the early 2000s. The Master of Law programs traditionally have many international students, and they really started picking up at the same time that there was this drop-off of JD students. So more law schools started increasing the number of international students who were pursuing Masters of Law. Why this is known as an LLM program. Why do these LLM programs exist? I think the basic idea is that, as you know, in a globalized economy, there's a demand for individuals who don't necessarily have JDs but have training in U.S. law, but are likely to be residing in their home country. So they can act as a conduit between local lawyers on the one hand and US JD lawyers who are in globalized law firms. So these LLM students or these graduates of LLM programs are kind of a bridge, can act as this bridge between the local legal systems that they live in and then the US legal system. And then, so in terms of our particular interest, when we're talking about international students, the particular focus is in the literature on a couple things. One is like the adjustment of these students to the host country or host school context, right? So we have students coming from different parts of the world, and they're entering a very sort of US-centric domain. So how are they adjusting to that new law school context? At the same time, many U.S. schools have certain values, and so one of their values is promoting intercultural interaction. So U.S. law schools or U.S. education in general hopes that there will be intercultural interaction. Likewise, for the students, to the extent that they're going to be involved in being a bridge between their home country and U.S. law firms or U.S. corporations. This is an opportunity to develop some soft skills, what we might call legal soft skills in sort of a cross-cultural context. So the research questions for me are looking at the networks amongst co-nationals, right? Students from the same home country in the context of U.S. law or law schools. Students come from different countries. What kinds of ties might they have? As well as ties between U.S. students, domestic students, and international students. And specifically, today we're going to focus on whether or not they were friends, to the extent that they studied together, meaning they have learning ties, and then also what are the determinants of their friendship ties, and what are the determinants of their learning ties, and whether or not those things are the same kinds of determinants. So that's the basic idea of today's talk. Yes?
After those international students finish the law school, do they stay in the States or they typically go back?
Many go back. There are only a couple states, like for example, New York State that will allow an LLM student to take the bar exam. So that's one state that students could take. An LLM student could take the bar exam in New York, but many of the states will not. Many of the state bars will not allow it. So I don't know the exact percentage of how many LLM students actually sit for the New York State bar, but I assume quite a few do. That's a great question. I should ask my colleague Carol Silver, one of the PIs. She would know the information. Yeah, so that's a great question. Like, what sort of jobs are the students getting after they graduate? The answer is I don't know the answer. I'd have to ask my collaborator, Carol Silver, who might have better data. But generally, there's not a lot of information about what happens to these students after they leave the LLM programs. Yeah, I don't know the answer of people with LLM degrees practicing in the United States. I don't know that information. Thank you. So just briefly, I'd like to go over some of the research in the higher education field in terms of social network studies. So there's a nice review piece by Biancani and McFarlane looking at higher education social networks, particularly the student networks. And the basic takeaway is that the vast majority of the studies up until recently were studies of friendship networks. So there hasn't been a lot of attention to learning networks, with the exception of, say, the last 8 years. And the typical things that people looked at in terms of predictors of these social networks were homophily and transitivity. And they're also interested in like whether or not these networks predicted academic success. So that's the general setup for also this kind of paper. Of course, many of you probably heard about Mario Small's book about weak tie confidants, somebody to talk to. And so that's a book that really emphasized the importance of weak ties in graduate work in U.S. education. So if we think about friendship ties as maybe being stronger, and Mario Small's work highlighting weak tie confidants, my own interest is sort of looking at whether or not we see those differences in terms of strong ties and weak ties in relationship to friendship networks and learning networks. And then briefly, in terms of studies of learning networks, there's a small literature. So I'm setting these out here for you. Most of the studies are looking at learning networks in relationship to academic performance. For example, one of the reasons why that's kind of interesting is if we think about peer effects, it's sort of like, what are the peer effects that matter? Are they the friendship peer effects that matter for academic performance, or are the learning networks peer effects matter? To my knowledge, there's one paper that's sort of pointing to learning networks as actually being the driver for peer effects, but there is one other study that's pointing to friendship networks. So it's kind of a new area. But if we're thinking about peer effects studies, most peer effects studies are based on friendship networks, and there aren't too many on the learning networks. And then in terms of, there are some studies about the coevolution of friendship ties and learning ties. They generally come out of the European context, where they're looking at, they're using a class of models known as stochastic act-oriented models that allow for studying the two. There are lots of assumptions there. I don't use this type of model that often, but I just wanted to point out that there are some papers in this area. Okay, so in terms of gaps, first, there are very few studies of learning ties, as I just said. Second, most of these papers are using a limited set of homophily measures. So given that we're looking at international students, we'll be looking at other kinds of predictors, particularly like something like nationality, as well as politics. And then third, almost all the studies, with the exception, I think, of one, are European undergraduate students. So there aren't many studies of non-European student populations. So for me, the research questions then are looking at to what extent do learning networks and friendship networks kind of match up with different forms of social capital, bridging social capital versus bonding social capital. And then specifically, I want to drill into this argument about what we call categorical closure, which is something that Professor Hong and I developed as one sort of predictor of some of the social networks that we observe. Just to give you a sense of what I'm going to find is that I'm not going to find a lot on what I had hoped for with respect to international students, but we do find some for JD students. Okay, so this comes from Professor Hong's paper and me with the rest of my collaborators on the CELS project. We published a paper in Social Networks this year. And just to, again, sort of highlight the ideas of explanations, we have some what we call the lower order processes, like density, the propensity for sending ties and receiving ties, as sort of lower order processes. The more traditional explanation of the role of homophily, birds of a feather flock together, and global transitivity, a friend of a friend is a friend, as sort of like the traditional predictors of social ties. And then what Professor Hong and I have added, or what we're hoping we add to the literature, is the idea of what we call differential transitivity, which is essentially an increased tendency for triads to become closed if the attributes are all the same. So we call this categorical transitivity or differential transitivity. If you think of global transitivity as essentially the increased tendency for a triadic closure, we're looking at the increased tendency for a triadic closure amongst nodes that share a characteristic. And again, coming from our paper, I hope that's okay, Professor. I feel like I'm presenting a lot of our research here. Well, we found some evidence of categorical closure. In this particular set of model results, the aquamarine bars tend to be higher than the, I guess it's like reddish orange bars. And the aquamarine bars, or the green bars, are the triads that all have the same attribute. So the same, for example, gender. So this will be an increased tendency for triads of, say, women, or triads of, say, men to become closed versus heterogeneous triads. So in our paper, we find evidence of categorical closure, and that's beyond the effects of homophily and global transitivity. So it's this additional effect of categorical transitivity. With the yeah, I would characterize it as sort of more like it's like group level homophily, right? It's one way to think about it, or it's the interaction between homophily and transitivity. So that's the way we typically think of. I think that's the way we think of it. It's really the interaction between the two. One of the ways to think about transitivity is that when you estimate transitivity in models, you're getting the effect for the entire observed network. And what we're adding is for the subgraph, as defined by an attribute, is that additional tendency beyond that overall effect. So it's a little bit of a refinement, I would say, building on past research, obviously. I would say that, however, like a lot of older thought, like we cite Georg Simmel as someone who actually discussed this increased tendency, but I think it was just not it's something he actually talked about is like the tendency for groups to exist are more likely if they have a shared attribute. Essentially, that's not quite exactly how he wrote it, but that's the essence of what he said. So that was sort of the inspiration of this idea, was to say, oh, let's try to estimate this difference beyond the average level. So it's essentially a subgraph analysis. Thank you for the question. Okay, so looking at the data and methods. As I said before, there are formative data for this particular analysis. I'm just using wave 1, which was conducted in October through November of 2019. So this is the 1L year of these students. This will be the fall semester, the very first semester for the law students and the LLM students. And then, because I'm focusing on international students, there are only 2 schools with significant international populations. So even though there are 3 schools in our data, I'm only looking at the 2 schools with significant international student populations. And here I'm looking to look initially at, here I'm going to look at the students that identified as an international student, as well as a small number of students who reported that they were not U.S. citizens, but were, so that essentially in U.S. context, it means that they're green card holders. So there's some permanent residents in the data as well, but it's very few. So most of the students are classified as international students and not green card holders. And then I'll be using a set of models known as exponential random graph models, which is a model that predicts tie probability in a network. Oh, before I go on, let me just say one further thing, which is, so in wave 1, what we did is we surveyed as many of the students as we could get to take the survey. So the response rate, I think, in one school was down like 60%, and the other school was like 65% and 70%. So these are the 2 schools with the higher response rates. And what we did was we provided a roster of all the students in their 1L year or LLM students. So if you were taking the survey, you could see the names of every student that was either a JD 1L or an LLM student. And we asked them to select up to 20 students that they either socialize with or discuss law school with. And then after they selected a student, we asked them to identify whether or not the student was, the person that they had nominated was either a friend, so they could select friend. We asked if they were an intimate, so they could also check off intimate. Very few students check that off. Professional, and then study partner as the 4th option. So in this study, a friendship tie is if they checked off friend, so they picked off the student off the roster, and then they also checked off that was a friend. And then a learning tie is if they checked off professional or study partner. And the reason why I include professional here is that this is law school, so some of the students are in essentially kind of like professional relationships with each other, like if they're serving on like moot court or something. So it's not necessarily they're studying together, but they're doing like pre-professional activity together, essentially what lawyers would do. So here are the 2 schools, and these are all the nominations that we got from both law schools. So this includes JD students and LLM students. And I just wanted to point out, so you can see where the LLM students were. In school 1, you can see there's like kind of like 3 balls, right? A very large ball of JD students, and then 2 smaller balls or clusters in school 1. And those are LLM students. And in school 2, again, you can see a slightly less organized, large cluster of JD students, and then maybe 2 or 3 smaller clusters of LLM students. So there's quite a bit of separation between the JD students and the LLM students. One of the reasons, and just to give some context as to why that is that in the 1L year of JD students, they all take the same classes together. They're organized into what are known as JD sections. And so if you are in, say, section 1 as a 1L versus section 2 of 1L, all the students in section 1 take their classes together in the fall semester. The LLM students have maybe a more diversified set of classes. Some of the classes overlap with some of the JD students, but it's not that they're all taking the same classes together. Okay, so first I wanted to show you some descriptive statistics. I think that's probably a little hard to read in the back of the room, so I'll just kind of talk through it. There are 4 panels. The first panel is density of the network. And I have school 1 and school 2. School 1 is in blue. School 2 is in orange. And then I've listed all ties, friendship ties, and learning ties. And these are just for the international students. So if you look at friendship ties, which are sort of the middle two columns, and learning ties, which are the right two columns for density, friendship ties are more dense in both schools. This is transitivity, so this is triadic closure. To what extent is transitivity present in the network? So friendship ties are more transitive than learning ties. Average degree in the network. There's higher average degree for both schools compared to in friendship ties versus learning ties. And lastly, mutuality, proportion of ties that are being reciprocated. Friendship ties have a higher degree of mutuality than learning ties. So what does that mean? So that means that according to these descriptive statistics, friendship ties are more associated with what we might call bonding social capital. They're more mutual, higher degrees of triadic closure, just more dense because there's higher levels of density, higher average degree. And learning ties are more associated with open triads and directed ties not being reciprocated, what we might call bridging social capital. Okay, so now we're drilling down and just looking at the LLM students, or sorry, not LLM students, international students specifically. In the top two panels, I have School 1 and School 2, color-coded by JD versus LLM students. I didn't choose the best colors here. Light blue is JD, dark blue is LLM students in School 1. So you can see that most of the students that are either international or not U.S. citizens are the LLM students. There's a small number of students that are international or not U.S. citizens who are in JD programs, but they're also very separated from the rest of the LLM students. Similar pattern with School 2. The LLM cluster is quite large. And then there's some scattered JD students that are international or not US citizens. What I'm not showing you here are the ties between these students and the US-based JD students. So that we're not seeing those. So even though they might look like, some of these JD students might look like isolates, they're not isolates, they actually have ties with other JD students. They're just not tied to this large cluster of LLM students. If we break it down by race, in School 1, there's a large cluster of Asian students on the left, the blue color, and then there's also a large cluster of green nodes that consist of students from Latin America. Similar pattern here in School 2, large cluster of students from Asia, and then also not as dominated by students from Latin America, but quite a few from Latin America in School 2. Okay, so that was just looking at the schools by program and by race. So here I've color-coded the nodes by nationality. So one of the things is in School 2 there are very few students from Taiwan. I think in School 2 there's like one or two up there, and in School 1, however, you can see dark blue is I think there are four students from Taiwan, and then there's a very large cluster of students from mainland China. So those are the LLM students from Asia. And then on the right side of School 1, you can see that there are a couple different nationalities represented in the right cluster, including students from Brazil, and then other Latin American countries. So the Brazilian students are the red colored node, and then from the rest of Latin America is more the pink colored nodes. And these are the friendship ties in School 1. In this panel, I got the learning ties represented for School 1. So one thing you will notice, I think you probably can see, is that in the friendship ties, the Brazilian students are are a little bit segregated from the other Latin American students, which kind of makes sense because linguistically, you know, they're speaking Portuguese, and the other students from Latin America are speaking, for the most part, speaking Spanish. But you don't see the same partition in the learning ties. The Brazilian students are more integrated with the rest of the students from other Latin American countries in the learning ties. But there is still segregation between the students from Latin America and students from Asia. For the students, the Chinese students in the friendship networks, it's a pretty clustered group of students. The Taiwanese students are kind of sort of linked to the students from mainland China, but they also have some connections with students from other countries, from the Latin American countries. So you can see they're sort of positioned a little bit in between in the friendship ties. Interestingly, in the learning ties, the students from Taiwan are more distributed around. So there's quite a bit more diversity in terms of who they're connected with. But the Chinese students from mainland China are very much still clustered. So that's the one thing that really struck out, was that the Chinese students from mainland China, both in friendship networks and learning networks, are pretty segregated from other students. Yeah, so yeah, you would expect friendship ties to be correlated with learning ties. Yeah, so that's one of the things we have not looked at yet, but we're planning to, which is to look at friendship-only ties, learning-only ties, and then those that combine both to see if it's the same set of predictors. So that's a great question. That's sort of our next step, because we kind of thought that friendship ties plus learning ties might be a kind of different kind of set of relationships versus friendship only and learning only. It's kind of hard to imagine like how someone might be a friend with someone but not ask for help from that person. But I'm guessing that happens for a fraction of the students. And likewise, it's more likely that there might be a learning tie that doesn't involve friendship. But maybe that learning tie over time will become a friendship. So down the road, we're hoping to kind of explore this issue more longitudinally to see which friendships also develop learning aspects to their relationship and which learning ties add friendship, to see if there are different sets of predictors. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so I just before coming here, I gave a talk in South Korea. So I talked about the South Korean students a lot there. But there's not too much of a story because the South Korean students they're all in the JD program, and all the Taiwanese students are in the LLM program. So I'm not sure why that's the case. I think with the LLM programs, law schools recruit from certain countries. So in this particular law school, I guess their LLM program does not recruit from South Korea, but it does recruit heavily from China, obviously, and there are some Taiwanese students in the data. Some of these South Korean students, they're not classified purely as international students because they're likely to be permanent residents, meaning that they're likely to become citizens eventually. Yeah, so there isn't much comparison between the Taiwanese students and the South Korean students. What is the discussion? I have to admit I'm not familiar with the discussions between. Okay. but to me, it's really interesting to see the Chinese students because there's so many students coming from China in graduate programs in the United States currently. Part of it might be financial because there's a lot of demand for U.S. education coming from China. And as you probably saw, law schools are hungry for LLM students, so they have quite a bit of students from China. And as you can imagine, the composition of a program, like in terms of different demographics, affects the sort of the networks that kind of get developed over time in school. So this is school 2. And again, just pointing out that LLM programs are going to be kind of different from each other because, say, one school, it might target certain countries. The other school might target some of the same countries, but also different countries. So let me jump ahead to these are the international students at school 2. Most of them are LLM again. I'm going to jump ahead to the nationality picture. So in this school, there are no Taiwanese students. There are, relative to the rest of the size of the class, the proportion that are from mainland China is smaller. There are more students from Europe in these data. So particularly from Western Europe, which is displayed as sort of like the dark yellow. The light yellow, are from Western European countries or Canada, and it's mostly Western European countries. And then there's a cluster of students coming from Eastern European countries like Ukraine and Russia, as well as students coming from Central Asian countries that are former or what we call post-Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So interesting enough, those students that are coming from Central Asia, perhaps again linguistically, because many of them probably speak Russian, are more clustered with Eastern European students. And then there's a small group of students from other countries in Asia, and they're all Thai, which is the light green in the friendship networks. And then, so those look pretty clustered by region. There are far fewer learning ties, but that clustering kind of dissipates a little bit in the learning ties. Again, you can see there's still structure, like the Chinese students tend to be more linked to the other Chinese students, but the level of segregation is much lower. So I would characterize these networks as being organized by nationality, but also social distance, particularly in the learning network, as well as in friendship networks, which is, students, they're likely to be tied to their co-nationals, and if they're not tied to their co-nationals, they're likely to be tied to socially proximate nationalities, like again, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and the Ukraine. Western European countries together. Okay, so turning to some of the regression results. These are the results of exponential random graph models. So it's not unlike logistic regression, where what we're predicting is the probability of a tie. And in fact, these could be interpreted as log odds coefficients. So for school 1, one of the interesting things about school 1 is it has the same set of predictors for friendship and learning, with the exception of the politics. First, there's hardly anything significant with respect to homophily, except for nationality. So nationality is driving the shape of the networks in school 1. There is some effects of political homophily. So in our data, we measure as how different they are in politics between two people. And so the negative coefficient here can be interpreted as political homophily. So at least in the friendship networks, there's political homophily. There's also the global transitivity effect that I talked about earlier, which is the standard account. So if you have homophily based on nationality and global transitivity, those two things together can produce those segregated clusters. And then, much to my chagrin, we have a negative interaction, which is the categorical closure effect. So categorical closure, which I was talking about as sort of like this increased tendency for triads to be closed if they share an attribute. Nothing significant except for nationality or region, and it's negative. So no evidence what I was hypothesizing. But there is someone who talks about this negative effect in another paper, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So one of the things I just wanted to point out too is that politics was measured with two questions. Basically, we asked respondents or students to the extent to which they were either liberal or conservative on economics and social issues. To the American students, that's pretty intuitive, I think. But how students from different countries interpreted that is less clear to me. So I'll have to go and look at the data a little bit because I'm kind of curious how, for example, students from mainland China might have answered this question. Like, how would they classify themselves economically or socially on that scale, and whether or not there are differences across countries in how they're talking about this. But it's pretty interesting that there's a political homophily effect, at least in friendships, for this particular school. No, it's reverse what we expected. So in the literature, there is actually someone who hypothesized a negative effect, and his name is Per Block, and he calls this a diminishing returns pattern when you have significant homophily effect, a positive, and a positive global transitivity effect. So he hypothesized a negative interaction, and so that's that negative pattern. So so that the basic argument for there is like you already have these big positive effects for ties existing based on homophily and transitivity. So so diminishing returns means it's just lower payoff for after, when you have the two combined. But it's not what I hypothesized or what Professor Hong and I hypothesized. Yeah, great question. So in the models, we're always checking for multicollinearity. These models are pretty forgiving, meaning you can have a little bit of higher level of collinearity, because essentially what we're doing is for a categorical closure region, we're estimating just for the subgraph, right? For a subgraph, whether or not there's a tendency for closure, but it's on top of that global closure effect. So it's really just capturing that above or below the average for the network. But yeah, it's something we pay attention to because there have been models that have unacceptable levels of multicollinearity in the data. So this is school 2. Again, there's a nationality region effect. Again, there's a political homophily effect, except this time it's in learning ties. Again, there's a global transitivity effect. And again, there's a negative categorical closure effect. Again, not consistent with expectations. So some of the key findings are that the predictors are the same for international students for the most part. Nationality matters a lot. We're finding some evidence of political homophily, though it depends on which tie we're looking at. We got global transitivity, which is a common finding, but then we have this negative effect of categorical closure. The results kind of support the idea that a lot of what's driving the network for international students is nationality and social distance. To what extent countries are kind of similar to each other. And again, triadic closure, not categorical closure. Okay, so in terms of some of the implications, one is that as I said, this is sort of a case study of, there are very few studies of international students. So this is, I think there's like maybe 2 studies in the European context. This is the only study I know that I think our data are the first to have looked at international students in US graduate programs. There's a lot of network segregation amongst internationalists by nationality, particularly for the Chinese students in both learning and friendship ties. Whereas there's some interesting differences for Brazilian students and students from other Latin American countries in terms of friendships and learning networks. So that seems to be driven by language. If you think about it, like why might Brazilian students and students from other Latin American countries be more integrated in their learning networks? It might be particular to US legal education. They're learning a lot of law concepts that are US-based law concepts that don't have ready translation into other languages. So they're speaking, when they're talking about law school, they're speaking in English to one another because they have to have that sort of refined legal understanding as articulated through the English language or English, because this is US law. So when they're talking about law school, they're speaking to each other in English, which means that their networks are going to be less co-national, whereas their friendship networks still remain co-national. It's interesting to me, however, that the Chinese students seem to be a little bit of exception compared to some of the other countries. How am I doing on time? 10 more minutes? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk now about the JD students, if that's okay. So this is with another graduate student, third year, Alexander Carl, and it's going to be a book chapter coming out, I think next year, in a Festschrift book in honor of my advisor, who's this guy Ed Lauman. But this is the first time I presented it. So going back to the overall network picture, now I want to talk about these really large clusters of JD students in both schools. And this will be pretty quick. So here are the friendship ties in school 1, color-coded by JD section. So recall that in US law schools, particularly the first semester of US law school, students all take the same classes together. Every class is the same. So if you're in section 1, you're taking every class in that fall semester with other students from section 1. So you can see there's some clustering amongst the friendship ties by JD section, but it's very obvious in the learning ties. Right? And that definitely makes sense, right? Students who are having the same classes together, i.e. they have the same assignments, they're going to be working with their section mates together. So we see a much more clearly defined section-specific structure in the learning ties compared to the friendship ties for school 1. This is school 2. In school 2, there are 3 JD sections. In school 1, there are 4 JD sections. A bit more clustering in the friendship ties by section compared to school 1. And I could talk about why that might be in a second. And then again, like school 1, very segregated networks by section in the learning ties. Just to give you context for what's the difference between school 1 and school 2. School 1 is essentially a top 10 law school. So it's extremely elite. So these are students coming from, I think about a third of them come from top universities and colleges and undergraduate. And many of them are preparing to go into what's known as big law in the United States. So big law is working at one of the 100 largest law firms in the United States. And these are oftentimes also globalized law firms. So many of the students from School 1 are going into big law, where the starting average salary is about $220,000 to $250,000 once you leave law school. And in School 2, this is what we might call a regional law school. It's not a top 20 program. It's more in the 50 to 100 best law schools in the country. So these students don't have the same. They're not coming in with the aspirations of going into big law. So in School 1, they go in there and they're basically told to network like crazy. Like they get there and they're basically told that law is a networking profession. So once you get to law school, you better start networking. Which is why you get a lot of networking and cross-section in the friendship ties in School 1. And in School 2, a lot of these law graduates might start up their own firms or work in smaller firms or work for the state attorney's office. So it's less high sort of profile kind of a student compared to 1/3 of the students coming from elite undergraduate colleges and universities. It's like 7% of the students. So most of the students are coming from elite backgrounds, and networking is not something that they're being told to do. So there are these sort of organizational differences across the law schools. And then just jumping to predictors for School 1 and School 2. So in terms of homophily, it might be a little hard to see, but basically there's racial homophily in School 1 for both the friendship and learning ties. There's also the section effect. So ties are more likely to occur within section in both friendship and learning ties. There's again a political homophily in friendship and learning ties in School 1. And then fortunately, for I think Professor Hong and me, we have some evidence of categorical closure in the friendship ties, but not the learning ties. In School 2, it's a little less clear pattern. We do have homophily effects, but this time it's in the learning ties for race and gender. Political homophily is present for the friendship ties, and then we again see evidence of categorical closure, mostly in the friendship ties, but there is one effect in the learning ties. So the results are largely consistent with the idea that categorical closure is present, particularly in the friendship ties amongst the JD students. So it's a bit more of a complicated story, whereas with the international students, the network's really being driven by nationality. With the JD students, who are almost all from the United States, many of them from the United States, they got a lot more going on in terms of race and politics, gender, and then also patterns of categorical closure. I didn't present anything from School 3, but this is essentially estimates of to what extent section effects were larger in learning ties versus friendship ties. So what's showing here is for Schools 1 and 2, you can ignore School 3, there's kind of a different story there. The section effects are much larger in the learning ties than in the friendship ties, which kind of makes sense because, again, to the extent that learning ties are academic, people are trying to figure out how to get their work done and study together, we would expect the section effects to be larger there, and that's what we get. Okay, so in terms of key findings from the JD students. For school 1, we have the same set of predictors for both friendship and learning ties. Not the case for homophily for school 2. For categorical closure, we've got categorical closure only in friendship ties for school 1 and mostly for school 2 as well. And then lastly, section effects are bigger in learning for both school 1 and school 2. Okay, so I'll just conclude with this last slide, which is sort of some takeaways about what we've kind of unpacked here. One is that there might be reasons to distinguish between friendship ties and learning ties. So to the extent that studies that are out in the literature and they're just looking at friendship nominations, they might be missing those learning ties. And to the extent that learning ties are more likely to be weak, that means they might be missing some of those weak ties. So that's something that's something that I would like to start delving into next, which is looking at friendship ties versus learning ties or their combination in relationship to grades. And one of the interesting things about law students is that for the entirety of their fall semester, they don't know the grades. They learn the grades at the end of the semester. So although we fielded this during the middle of their fall semester, none of them knew their grades, but we do start collecting their grades in wave 2 for their fall semester grades. So we'll be able to see the extent to which that these learning ties or friendship ties or both predicted academic performance. Second thing, particularly with respect to international students, is that there seem to be important opportunities to intervene on learning networks for international students. As you can imagine, for friendship networks are oftentimes going to be important sources of social support. Students coming from other countries, studying in the United States, I can't imagine what it's like. I imagine it's really hard. Professor Hong probably couldn't say it's really hard. You gotta learn a new language oftentimes, get used to strange American customs. That's a lot of work. So I totally understand why a lot of international students have ties with other co-nationals, because it's literally like learning how to navigate a different culture, right? At the same time, learning ties appear to be a good place to intervene to create those cross-cultural interactions. And so you could have both, right? You could have students building social support networks with co-nationals, as well as networks to socialize and do things with. But those learning networks might be opportunities to develop cross-boundary or cross-national situations, particularly in the context of education, since many of the students will be speaking the same language, which will be, in the United States context, English, and they'll be learning those concepts of English. So there are advantages to bridging nationality in the learning ties specifically. And then lastly, it's an open question as to whether or not learning ties or friendship ties matter more in terms of peer effects and academic performance. To the extent that we think that learning ties are actually the weak ties, maybe better for transmitting information. It might be that the learning ties are actually the more important for peer effects than friendship effects. So again, that's sort of one of the future questions for the research. I want to all thank you for listening to me talk for about an hour. I'm happy to take questions.
Presentation is really wonderful. So now it's open for questions. So if you have any question, just raise your hands. Any question will be appreciated.
Thanks for your interesting talk. However, I do have a question. My question is, can your argument here be related to some theory regarding the strength of ties, such as a granular because basically you talk about the types of network, but you didn't talk about the strength of network. So that I wonder how your theory can be related to the theory of strength.
Great question. Yeah, and I actually, thank you for bringing that up. I actually forgot to mention that one of the things we did look at was to what extent a tie was close or not close. So after students nominate their network partners, we did ask them about their frequency of interaction and also the closeness of the relationship. So on average, friendship ties are closer than learning ties. So it's consistent with the idea that learning ties are more the weak ties, and that the network structures are also consistent with the theory, which they're also the open triads as well.
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Tinya from Department of Sociology here. I know that this study is only conducted in the law schools, but I was wondering, like, from your own observation, do you find any special features of law schools, like compared to other PhD programs, grad programs? And if there are, how do they affect, like, the results you have now?
That's a fantastic question. There are some peculiarities of law school that you don't necessarily get in PhD programs. So what's distinctive about law schools and other professional programs, like maybe an MBA program or like a Master's in Public Policy program, is oftentimes those schools assign students to sections. And one thing I forgot to mention in the context of law school sections is that it's quasi-random. It's not entirely random because they are trying to pay attention to, they want to make sure that there isn't a student that is the only one of that particular category in that section. So it's not entirely random, but most students are assigned at random into the JD sections. Obviously, that doesn't apply to the LLM students. Whereas in a PhD program, probably as many of the faculty can attest, they don't have that random assignment process, which kind of shakes up and creates opportunities for creating ties across boundaries. So in some ways, maybe in PhD programs, some of the friendship dynamics are much stronger there, and you're not going to get some of the alterations or intervening on the learning network side that you get at a law school.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting and it brought back a lot of great memory when I was for me when I was an international student in America, not at law school, by the way. So my question is, I was curious, how did you and you two come up with this general idea of categorical closure? Because it feels like, I mean, I do have this hunch that, correct me if I'm wrong, so homophily will help general transitivity get close to become categorical closure. I do have this intuition, but the other part of me kind of just talk to myself, and why wouldn't the two, homophily and general transitivity, just work independently? Why one should interact with the other? What's the kind of the general mechanism?
So great question. So why, if I understood correctly, why didn't people do this before? Why didn't people think about these things working together earlier? I think I'll let Professor Hong speak, but I think partly it's technology, and but these ideas are older. They've existed for a long time, like Harrison White's concept of catnets, categorical networks. Like, to me, those ideas are consistent with categorical closure, but in this modeling framework, it really wasn't something that was explored or an option. You want to chime in?
people interact with one another, not just because they know one another, but also they share the same attributes. So that's why we feel it's very important to combine them together to better fit the real world data. So I think that's one of the reasons we propose these ideas. We foreground these ideas, which have been overlooked in prior studies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like I said, some of the ideas pre-exist. You know, these ideas have been around for a long time, but maybe they weren't featured. I remember when I was a graduate student, I was taking a class with Ron Burt, and he would always talk about pay attention to structure, because once you think about structure as the mediator, all the attribute effects will go away, and he didn't want us to pay attention to attributes much. So I think that was just that was a focus for a long time.
A little historical background to that. Transitivity is a starting point of network analysis because it involves three actors. It is a total relation. Why should I have a type with it? Because the presence of the other two types. Categorical is still dyadic. It's because you and I share some attribute in common. So that's a clear line between whether we are talking about a type, a dyadic interaction, or what we consider we take into account our surrounding network. So it's still a line. And exactly that's the line where social network analysis begins. So it's a little historical background.
My name is Guoxian Su. I'm from the NTU department. Yeah, I cannot help to jump into the discussion because I was at Columbia at that time when Harrison White and Ron Burt has this debate, and with Peter Blau. And Peter Blau think social network is not a practical approach because the data requirement is too demanding. But the combination of homophily principle and transitivity will lead to categorical boundary. So using what he called a nominal group is sufficient enough because the network operate toward to form categorical group based on attribute. So the only thing Blau point out that is valuable is whether to study the attribute will consolidate or the attribute will cross-cutting. Okay, but network has this kind of a blind spot that we only examine one attribute at one time. When you combine, like 4 or 5 attributes, we don't know how they operate. But Peter Blau has this very simplified ideas about if you study cross-cutting, the degree of cross-cutting or consolidation, then it might be easier than collecting all the data and at the end you find out, people still based on their behavior, based on attribute and category. Yeah, that's my comment.
These are great insights. And one of the things that Professor Hong and I are working on today, going forward, hopefully, and we'll hopefully see the light of day someday, is if we think about some of the ideas that Peter Blau talks about, which is to what extent is one attribute correlated with another attribute, like say like class and race, right? For Peter Blau refers to that as consolidation, and there's some research out there. I think one of the papers by Kosinetz and Watts that was in the American Journal of Sociology, that was a network study. And what they did in terms of measuring homophily in that study is they counted the number of shared attributes in a dyad, and it was just a count, right? So like the homophily effect that was estimated in that paper was based on it wasn't gender homophily; it was just how many of the same attributes mattered. And in the paper by myself and Mark Pachucky and Shinfei Tu, we published it in Social Networks. We used the same measure, and what we found using egocentric data was that the typical tie between a respondent and a nominated alter, they shared an average of 3 characteristics. So there is quite a bit of consolidation in a lot of these edges. So one of the things that Professor Hong and I are interested is thinking about the intersections beyond just, say, homophily and transitivity, which is what I talked about today. We started looking at multidimensional homophily or intersectional homophily. And so we're starting to look at how do two types of homophily interact with each other, and whether or not that can help us explain some of the patterns. And so it is possible that one avenue of things combining, which is categorical closure, but another avenue might be intersectional or multidimensional homophily, which also can give rise to sociodemographic clustering. Which is, and I was gonna, if I had time, I would present some of that stuff. But that's currently what we're working on today.
My question will, I'm a student from Graduate Institute of National Development, and my question, I'm curious about the collectivism and the individualism in between Taiwan and, I don't know, Western and East culture. I mean that this study is most based on Western, or I mean whether the insight is that a approach about the study, because in East Asia we tend to have a collective society, so supposedly women will work together more, and compared to East Asia society, in the how about Western society effects? Yeah, individual effect.
Yeah, so this is a great point, which is a lot of what I presented today did not look at specific nationalities and differences across nationalities. Like, I didn't estimate a homophily effect for Chinese nationals, right? Those from mainland China, as distinct from, say, students from Brazil. I estimated sort of an average homophily effect across all nations. So yeah, it's something I actually didn't look at. It's a great question. I empirically, I don't know the answer, but it did seem like that there was, homophily seemed to matter more, or at least homophily and transitivity mattered more maybe amongst Chinese students, but empirically I didn't test that. But it's something I should look at for sure.
According to your observation, do you think that law school students from East Asia and law school compared to law students from Western society, the comparison will be different? But no, their level will be different, or is the same among law school students?
I think visually you can see that it is different. But I didn't actually test that empirically. To address your question, there's a set of empirical tests I should do before saying that they're definitely different. But I think visually they look different to me. I think whether or not that's a cultural difference, I don't know. But yeah, so basically I didn't test what you are asking for, but I think you're on the right track.
Sorry, I think I already asked a lot of questions. So I'm from economics, and I also study social networks, but basically look at some economic applications. So I used this ERG model before. So when I use this ERG model, some people ask me that, so you use the ERG to control for some dependence across the links, but how about like some unobserved confounding factors? So I think it's quite difficult, because if you want to address these are kind of like unobservables in this ERG model, it looks like that you cannot use the current package. You have to like maybe do your own coding. So I want to know about what's your opinion about this. And another question I have is that I remember that you mentioned in the very beginning you have like collect the data in several waves. So what's your idea that you are going to like exploit the second wave or third wave to enhance your findings? Thank you.
Yeah, I think your point is excellent in terms of unobserved, covariates and developing models to account for it. I wait for someone to develop them and so I can work on them. I would say that yes, that's very much a legitimate issue. We were actually talking about some of the things that are unobserved or typically not measured in social networks research, like MRI information, as something that might be driving the network structure, which is quite possible. So yeah, that's definitely something that I'm interested in, but I have not coded myself. The other thing is so for the longitudinal piece, what I presented today is just cross-sectional. The paper that I cited by Professor Hong and myself is a longitudinal paper where we used separable temporal ergum to look at tide formation and tide dissolution. And in that paper, what we found was that categorical closure mattered only for tide formation, not tide dissolution. So a little bit more, it's something we actually expected, but it tells you something about the importance of social selection processes and that categorical closure matters for social selection. But when it comes to existing ties, categorical closure doesn't mean those are more durable. It's which kind of makes sense from the standpoint of sunk costs. Like sunk costs, they exist, and so it doesn't really matter who they're with.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I learned a lot from your work. I have two questions. One is about gender. It seems you mentioned gender briefly, but can you elaborate more about your findings, whether that apply to both genders or multiple genders? And the second one is about policy implication of your findings. For example, nowadays in NTU, we have a lot of international students, and we usually encourage students to mingle with these international students. We might have the group discussion in order to create the academic learning ties, and maybe that can transfer to friendship ties. So I wonder whether your findings can offer us some insights about education policies. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Yes, gender, I didn't mention too much in the study, but I should have, because in the literature, particularly with respect to learning ties, gender homophily has been detected. So a number of studies have found gender homophily in learning ties. I think in the context of international students, gender homophily wasn't present. And it kind of makes sense because, again, we have students who are away from their home country. Finding co-national support is really driving the network, regardless of gender. And in our data, we do have some non-binary students, but there are not that many. There's like 6 in our data, so we group them with the women in our data. But in this analysis, gender homophily wasn't detected for the international students. I think for the JD students in school 2, there was some gender homophily. But we have detected some categorical closure based on gender in our other paper. Is that right? Yeah, so gender does matter in categorical closure for the JD students. And then, yes, in terms of the policy implications, as I was saying, to the extent that, that we think that weak ties are particularly important for information transmission, and they may be more linked to peer effects than, and they might be easier to intervene on since they're educationally focused, task focused. Those things might be to the extent that institutions or departments can foster the formation of cross-boundary learning ties. Those might have good payoffs. I think friendship ties that's a harder nut to crack. And maybe the learning ties become the basis for friendship ties to form. Yeah, great question.
I have a question about the learning ties. Not so technical. I'm just curious about the meaning of the learning ties. So you found that there are fewer, for example, reciprocities. when we observe learning ties, but by definition, when we say we studying with someone else, and the other students say, no, I didn't study with the students of the focus. I'm just curious about how to interpret the directions of the learning ties in this context.
I think that's a great question, which kind of makes sense, right? To the extent when we study nomination patterns, people tend to be good at nominating their close friends and not so good nominating weak ties. And so in some respects, maybe the fact that we have lower mutuality in the learning ties, because let's say I nominate Professor Hong as a learning partner and Professor Hong doesn't nominate me, but we definitely did study together. It's partly related to how we're measuring the tie, which is we asked them to nominate 20 people, and maybe Professor Hong filled up the 20 people with close friends and had to drop out the learning ties, whereas like I only have 5 friends, and so I went deep into my learning tie stable to find connections. So partly it might be the measurements of this and the fact that we're relying on name generators. So we would expect learning ties to be more likely to be subject to measurement issues than friendship ties, I think.
So thank you again for Professor Paik's presentation.
Thank you.